Lili by Martin Sanders Whiteley. Chapter 3 Awakening. I was lost in darkness. I thought I could hear sirens for a moment, but the sound quickly faded. A voice seemed to be calling me from a distance, but it was muffled. I could make out the words, "Where are you?" and a glimpse of a flickering light before they faded back into the darkness. My experience with the woman in Chelsea replayed in my head again and again. When I opened my eyes, I was still lost in darkness. I tried to move my hands. They bumped painfully into something that felt like wood right above me. A horrible thought came into my head. I had been buried alive. I instinctively began swinging my fists at what I guessed was the lid of my coffin. I tried to scream, but I found it impossible. My lungs felt heavy, like they were full of some vile substance. I wondered how I was still breathing. Then there came a scraping sound above my head. It sounded like someone digging with a shovel. My fears were confirmed and new worries materialized. Did the person who was digging me up know I had been buried alive and want to help me? Or did they mean to use my body to their own ends? Were they a grave robber? Or a necrophiliac? The sound of the shovel was grating, but I eventually became numb to it. When the digging sound was closest to me, it suddenly stopped. Then the lid was opened, and I saw a face staring into mine. After my eyes had adjusted, I recognized the face as that of Mina Harker, Jonathan's wife, Jonathan's dead wife. I had seen her picture in the obituaries. Before I could react, she grabbed me by the arm and dragged me with superhuman strength out of the grave, scaling the side of the grave with her remaining hands and feet. When we reached the surface, I barely managed to stand up. We were in the cemetery by my house, the one I had walked past endless times. It was night, and the moon was shining freely. Mina's skin was extremely pale, like that of the woman in Chelsea. Her hair was unkempt and dirty, but still beautiful somehow. She wore a long white gown. A nightgown or a burial gown? And her eyes had the same sad, world-worn look I had seen in the eyes of Laura and the mysterious woman. It was not as ancient as the look in the eyes of the woman, but more intense than the look in Laura's eyes. Mina was dead, and standing before me. I tried to speak again, but still found myself unable. How am I breathing? "Your lungs are filled with dirt," Mina said in a crisp, clear voice. "Try to cough it out." I coughed once, which involuntarily led to a fit of coughing that covered the ground with bloody dirt. I could have sworn I saw at least one maggot in the pile of earth and sick. As unsettling as this was, I was just grateful for empty lungs. I tried speaking again. "You're dead," I said to Mina. She nodded. "So are you." She was pointing at something behind me. I turned to see a headstone behind the 6-foot-deep hole Mina had just pulled me out of. It simply read, "Lili." I had expected it, but it was still unsettling to see my own name added to those of the countless dead in the cemetery. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell Mina I was not dead, that I'd been buried alive, and she probably had been too, when I felt a sharp pain in my heart. It was as if I had just been shot with an arrow. I cried out in piercing agony, falling to my knees and clutching at the spot where I felt the pain. Then as suddenly as it began, the pain stopped. Mina, who had been calm up until this point, rushed to my side. "Are you all right?" she asked, worry in her voice. There was a sharp pain here. I kept my hand over my heart. "It's gone now." "Who bit you, Lili?" Mina asked. "Bit me?" "You're a vampire," Mina explained, as if she had heard my question. She opened her mouth to reveal a pair of razor-sharp, kill-ready fangs. I wasn't expecting this. I expected myself to break down, to panic, to rethink my entire life. But I didn't. Instead, my mind drifted back to the woman. I remembered how her lips had seemed to hide something. "I remember who bit me," I told Mina. Mina raised an eyebrow. "Tell me," I told her everything that had happened from my attempt to drown myself onward. When I finished, Mina simply nodded. This is what she had expected to hear. Then she looked down at her feet, took a deep breath, and looked back up. The woman who bit you was probably killed, said Mina. That's why you felt pain. The look in her eyes was that of a parent telling their child that a relative had passed away, or that they were going to have to put down the family pet. The knowledge that the woman was dead sent a pain into my heart that faintly echoed the arrow pang. Despite my repulsion from her, I had felt a connection to her beyond the obvious supernatural one. And strangely enough, the fact that she had bitten me was a relief. It was better than what I had dreaded. I felt free. I tried not to show my sadness at the loss of my killer, as I didn't want Mina to think I was weak, but I could tell that she noticed anyway. Sensing the tension in the air, Mina suddenly spoke. I'm terribly sorry. I never introduced myself. I'm Mina. She smiled with genuine kindness, extending a pale, bloodless hand. We shook hands. Pleased to meet you, I said, smiling for the first time since leaving the grave. I've seen your picture in the newspaper. Really? Mina laughed, a full, rich sound that widened my smile. I didn't know I was that famous. It was an obituary. Ah, Mina said with mock seriousness, the smile never leaving her face. Why did you want to jump into the river? Her happiness was suddenly gone, replaced with an almost motherly concern. I explained my situation with Laura. When I had finished, Mina nodded thoughtfully. I promise, she said, that I will help you find her. I let out a small, tittering laugh of incredulousness, then immediately covered my mouth in embarrassment. Why are you helping me? I asked. Because no one has any right to keep you apart, said Mina, her voice full of calm conviction. A honey, sweet happiness started to fill me. Save for Laura, no one had ever been this kind to me, willing to go so far. Then a thought entered my head, and the happiness evaporated. I gasped. She had to know. What is it? There was another reason I wanted to die. Oh? Mina raised an eyebrow. I locked eyes with Mina, pouring all the revulsion I had felt into one word. Jonathan. The animal began to creep back into Mina. There was an inferno behind her eyes, and her mouth twisted into a wolfish mockery of her smile. For the first time, I was afraid of Mina Harker. Yes, she said in a voice that dripped with sugar-coated venom, like candy apple concealing razor blade. Tell me about dear Jonathan. Chapter 4. Resurrection and Revenge. We set out to find Jonathan, but there was something else we had to do first. Mina and I approached a large, ornate crypt. The mausoleum's exterior was decorated with images of solemnly mourning angels and tiny weeping cherubs. There was an odd sense of mockery in the expressions of the carvings that I couldn't place. The moonlight cut through the midnight fog enough for me to make out a name. Lucy Weston. Come on, Mina said, motioning to the door of the mausoleum. As we got closer, I could see that it had already been broken into. Lucy Weston. I had seen her picture in the obituaries. Shortly after her death, articles about a mysterious woman in white who preyed on stray children began to appear in the newspaper. The few adult eyewitnesses to this woman's wanderings had noted an odd resemblance to Lucy Weston. There was now no doubt in my mind that Lucy was the woman in white. I wondered if the crypt might have been broken out of instead of into, but I doubted it. All mentions of attacks by the woman in white had stopped a long time ago, which probably meant someone had broken in and killed Lucy. So why were we here? We had now reached Lucy's final resting place. She was hardly resting in peace. In the center of the room was a long black coffin, the lid open to reveal Lucy Weston with a wooden stake through her heart. Her white burial gown was spattered with blood, and her face wore an expression of pure agony. She had begun to rot, but somehow she retained a strange sort of necromantic beauty. Without hesitation, Mina walked up to Lucy's decaying body and pulled the stake out of her heart. The blood began to flow back into the gaping wound in her chest, and then the wound closed itself, bits of tissue rejoining until her chest was as it once was. Then the threads of Lucy's gown began to reassemble the fabric, until there was no evidence of a hole having ever been there. It was like watching a film played backwards. Lucy's eyes shot open. Leaping from the coffin and landing on her feet effortlessly, she locked eyes with Mina. "Sister," she said in a smooth, silky voice that dripped from her mouth like blood. "Sister," Mina repeated warmly, breaking into a smile and embracing Lucy, whose supernatural mystique melted into welcoming happiness. "He got you too, then?" Lucy asked grimly. Mina nodded. "But he's gone now. We're free." A look of startled joy came over Lucy, who looked like she might break out in either laughter or tears at any time. "Thank God." Then her eyes drifted over to where I was standing, and joy gave way to confusion and suspicion. "Who's this, Mina?" "This is Lili." "Hi," I said lamely, raising my hand in a gesture that barely passed for waving. "She's only recently become like us," Mina continued. "I saw the conditions she had died under in the obituaries, and figured she'd been bitten, so I decided to lend a hand." I grinned. I wasn't the only one doing detective work based on the obituaries. Lucy looked concerned again. "I thought you said he was..." "He is. This is someone else. But you can get acquainted on the way. We need to pay a little visit to Jonathan." The three of us stood outside Jonathan's window. He was sitting in his armchair, almost asleep. We glided to the front door. I didn't think about it in the moment, but afterwards I tried to remember if my feet had been touching the ground. I like to think that they weren't. I knocked on the door. It swung open to reveal a groggy-looking Jonathan Harker rubbing his eyes in the warm yellow light of his house. "Hello," Jonathan said as politely as he could while stifling a yawn. He was still rubbing his eyes, looking down at his feet. He hadn't recognized us yet. "How can I help you?" "We aren't from around here." I gestured to Mina and Lucy. I was praying he wouldn't look up before we made it inside. We couldn't break in. A vampire needs an invitation to enter any building. "I'm afraid we're lost. Could you let us in so we can warm up and get some directions?" "You are very cold," said Jonathan, feeling my lifeless hands. I resisted the urge to pull away. He hadn't looked up at our faces yet, but he wasn't looking at my hands either. He was looking at something else. I had the sudden urge to stab him repeatedly. "Come in," he said without looking up, his mouth curling into a smile that made me want to pull all his teeth out individually. As soon as we stepped across the threshold, all warmth seemed to be drained from the yellow light. It looked ghostly, like light reflected in the eyes of someone who had seen too much. Jonathan, for example. He had finally looked up. He didn't say anything, but his pupils had changed size. He seemed to be paralyzed with fear. I wanted to rush him, kill him viciously. I wanted to tear his eyes out so he could never look at me again. But Mina put a hand on my shoulder. "Leave my husband to me," she whispered in my ear. I blinked, and she already had him up against the wall, hand around his throat. Jonathan was crying, whimpering slightly. The sadistic wolf smile had returned to Mina's face. I could only watch in horror. As much as Jonathan repelled me, I felt terrible for him. Mina put her fangs slowly into his neck, trying to make the pain last as long as possible. Jonathan was trying to scream, but he couldn't breathe. I couldn't take any more. I walked outside to wait until it was all over. Mina eventually came out, blood smeared around her mouth and down her white gown. "I've set his body on fire so he can't come back," she said, as if nothing had happened. "What did he do to you to make you hate him so much?" I asked. What are you talking about? I adore Jonathan. That's why I had to kiss him one last time. Now, did you say it was Styria you wanted to go to?